Kilmacurragh, a short story by R.M. Clarke, read by R.M. Clarke. Earlier that day, I walked across the tracks to the shore and offered a blushing fruit to Bridget. I chose a space between the pebble beach and the marsh, where a white feather lay in wait on a wiry thong of sandgrass, as though it was a long-standing appointment. Before I sliced the fruit across with the small knife I carried in my coat pocket, I walked along the line of white silt and looked out. The sea advanced hungrily. I found a stone between surges, the sheer, sturdy orange of a long-burning fire, and laid it down between the two dripping halves of blood-speckled flesh. A woman and her dog approached along the tracks, and I tucked the knife out of sight quickly and left. The men from the building company and the architect were arriving in a few hours. I was to meet them at the house before lunch. On the road into Wicklow, I stopped in at Hunter's for tea. The bar was empty, and I took a seat at a table closest to the fire. I ordered from the waitress, a neat woman dressed in black who disappeared through a door behind the bar without writing anything down. The slow beat of the clock swallowed up the moments of silence in her absence. In the spaces between the beats, the echoes stretched out, and the room and everything in it stilled. I wedged myself between the end of one beat and the beginning of the next, and pushed against the boundaries of silence, and drew them out as wide as they could go before the hand slotted into place again, as though it were taking a breath. The winter sun shone through the window, illuminating the marks of many sharp points, a list of 3 names, and a date, August 1st, 1944. Outside in the rowan tree, a fevered pair of blue tits worked together, loosening seeds from the feeder. A third waited alert and patient on a low branch, taking its place when one of the birds fluttered away. Another bird, small and brown and golden-shirred along the flank, appeared on the same spot on the branch, and waited. They queued up like this for some time, one after another and another. After the tea came, the waitress dressed in black knelt beside me and fed thick logs to the fire. The road out to the house grew emptier and wild as I wound deeper between the mountains. After a series of bordered fields, I came at last to the gate. I turned the car in and went slowly up the narrow drive. Ancient trees leaned over the road, curious. The path wove to the right, then bent sharply to the left and turned finally into the public car park. Before Christmas, the architect had shown the plan for a private entrance. "We won't have you be a visitor in your own home," the foreman had said, and we had all quietly laughed. There were 2 other cars in the car park, but I did not recognize the cars as those of the architect or foreman. The air was bitingly cold. The cafe was open, and I called in to ask for soup. Again I envisioned how it would be to live there in the busy half of the year, when the car park and public toilets were full and the gardens black, and plates and cups clanged in the cafe at the back of the house. The decrepit outhouse wall that ran along the south of the gardens would be converted into my workspace. Floor-to-ceiling sliding windows would open a view into a path underseeded with flower in the summer months. On warm days, I could leave them open entirely. A loud rumbling sound from outside told me the building company truck had arrived. The architect and foreman were shaking hands and laughing. As I came towards them across the car park with arms folded against the cold, they stopped and watched me. They followed me back into the cafe, and tea was made for us. They spread out the drawings and, once again, the architect explained. Out in the air, long lines of fresh wood were bundled tightly on the truck platform. I stood back while the foreman opened the site gates and the truck reversed in. The family of rooks living in the broken roof shrieked and lifted into the sky. When they settled again, they turned their heads to the work and watched. The architect pointed into the distance, and the foreman and I followed the line of his arm. The arm itself seemed to be saying, "All of this will be yours." But the rest of him was saying something about aspect. The foreman nodded knowingly. My attention was taken by something else. Before the great audience of the valley, a huddle of evergreens were knotted tightly against the fierce February wind. It was the first present light of the year, no longer enduring from a passed-on place, but come to consciousness again and cruel for it. In the searing light that pierced and saw everything, The evergreens were stung red, each leaf tip swallowed and leapt across and consumptive. The workers began moving about, and I walked past the crumpled stone walls into the gardens. I was the only visitor. Inside the entrance, a heavy scent emanated from a waxy pink plant that looked and smelt like jasmine. It was not jasmine, but hinted at it or pretended. It had a Latin name I could not decipher. The heritage man had told me the name in the summer, but I had forgotten. I lingered always now when I came to it, trying to remember the word attached to its sweet and deliberate pink. Outside, the garden walls boomed the pounding echoes of work. My hands were cold. I put them inside my coat pockets and my right hand began to sting. I realized I had forgotten to take the knife out. A thin red line ran across my index finger, and as I watched the blood bloom, I thought of a statue I had seen in the garden of an artist who lived nearby, a large stone digit pointing into the sky, inscribed with the words, "Create or die." My finger began to slowly weep. I pulled my sleeve down over it. Between the trees, at far sight, people were moving about with wheelbarrows. Close by, the trees were rustling, but not loud enough to overcome a distant sound like that of a constant groan. And something else was moving fast, though I could not yet see it, its approach preceded by a high-pitched wheeze. Then a small electric car tore around the corner, rowed by a long-haired man. He was laughing as he slowed to an abrupt stop under the nearby skirts of a willow. When he emerged at last from the car, he had in his hands a bag of compost and a spade. He leaned them against the trunk and pulled up old growth and leaves that had scattered from the trees along the path and bundled them into an empty sack. He opened the bag of compost and threw it across the earth's surface. With the spade, he sliced in and folded the black, wet feed into the cold earth, circling and circling. At last he straightened up and turned to me. "It'll be done yet, and then it'll never be done." "You're right," I said. "Before next winter, anyhow." He nodded, and I nodded back. He threw his bits back into the car, finished as soon as he had begun. He turned back to me. "Are you the one who's moving in, then?" he asked. "I am." He drew his mouth tightly together and whistled. "That's an undertaking," he said softly. "We'll be seeing each other again, so." He climbed back into the car and tore off at the same urgent pace, saluting me as he left. "The gardeners will stay on when I move into the house. It was written into the contract. The garden must continue to be shared with the public. I will have my own garden, sectioned off, marked out of bounds by a sign and a gate." Continuing on the paths, I saw the signs warning visitors about yew blight had not yet been taken down. The heritage man had told me about it. It drew the water from the soil, suffocating the trees from the inside out. Unseen spores crept from root to root, drawn underfoot across the grass. Then, honeyed by the summer, the trees had been rich and full-leafed, the birdsong rippling across a canopy, warmed by soft light. Hard to see, then, their quiet suffering. There were measures in place to stop its spread. The affected soil had been dug into trenches. All visitors had to keep to the paths, every gardener to wash down their gloves and boots. They were, he said, fastidious with these measures. There was a problem with the ash as well, he said, but that was a different matter. The trees nodded benignly as he explained, as though agreeing to their own devastation. The pond had roaring yellow-tongued lilies in the grasses then. Only one or two had survived the winter, their lonely golden heads. The water was mottled and gone off-looking, dead arms of old growth grasping above the water, searching for the light. By the pond a gate stood without walls, woven through with old tendrils of ivy. The bricks tapered off into earth. Beyond the lost boundary, the cedar wood reached empty-floored up the hill into the dark. The gate was rusted over. I tried it, but it was locked. I looked a while through the closed gate, at the trees carved up by red iron bars, then walked back to the house. As I returned to the site, the architect turned to face me, as though he had sensed my approach from some way off, or had been watching for me. If I was cold, he said, I did not have to stay. The foreman shouted at one of his workers, and as the others turned to watch, the pounding sound of their work paused, drawing everything into a brief stillness. My finger began to throb again, and I laid it quickly on my tongue.